A pot of rice was already on the stove before anyone in the house woke up. In a 1960s Mexican-American kitchen, that single pot was not a side dish. It was the whole plan. One bag of rice, a few chilies, maybe some leftover beans, and dinner was handled for the week. Your abuela stretched that grain further than any restaurant chef alive today could imagine. And the dishes she made from it were not simple. They were brilliant. Some of them fed entire families on almost nothing. Others turned a handful of rice into a meal so good, people still dream about it decades later. Number 7 on this list turned 1 cup of dry rice into a dish that could feed a table of 8. And number 19 used an ingredient most kitchens today would throw straight in the trash. Here are 25 forgotten Mexican rice dishes your grandparents ate to survive. So hit subscribe, because some of these deserve to come back. Number 25. Arroz empedrado. This was rice studded with whole pinto beans, cooked together in the same pot until the grains swelled around the beans like cobblestones in a dirt road. That is where the name came from. Empedrado means paved. In the 1950s and 1960s, families across Jalisco and Michoacan made this when there was not enough meat or even enough beans to serve on their own. You toasted the rice dry in a little lard, added the soaked beans, poured in water seasoned with cumin and a dried guajillo, and let the whole thing simmer under a lid until everything melted together. One pot, no waste, and every grain carried the flavor of the beans. By the time fast food spread through the border towns in the 1980s, empedrado quietly disappeared from most family tables. Number 24. Arroz con huevo. Not a fancy omelet. Not even fried rice the way you might picture it. This was cold leftover rice from the night before, tossed into a hot skillet with a little oil and 2 or 3 beaten eggs scrambled straight into it. That was breakfast. In South Texas and across the Rio Grande Valley, this was what you ate before school when there was nothing else in the kitchen. Some families added a spoonful of salsa or a few drops of Valentina. Others ate it plain with a warm tortilla on the side. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes and it kept you full until lunch. It cost almost nothing and every family made it a little differently, but the bones of the dish were always the same. Leftover rice, eggs, heat. Number 23. Sopa seca de arroz. The name itself confuses people, a dry soup. But that is exactly what it was. You toasted raw rice in hot oil until it turned golden, then simmered it in a pureed tomato broth with onion and garlic until every drop of liquid was absorbed. The result was not soupy at all. It was fluffy, bright red, and packed with flavor from the toasting. In the 1960s across central Mexico and into Texas border towns, this was served as its own course, not as a side. Families treated it as the second plate, right after the actual soup. That 2-course structure faded as Mexican-American households adopted quicker weeknight cooking, and sopa seca became just another scoop of red rice on the edge of the plate. Number 22. Arroz con calabaza, squash and rice, cooked together with a little epazote and a dried ancho chili. In rural Oaxaca and Puebla during the 1950s and 1960s, calabaza was one of the cheapest vegetables available, and families grew it in backyard gardens alongside corn and beans. The 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, had grown side by side in Mexican soil for thousands of years, and calabaza was always the most generous of the 3. You diced the squash small, sautéed it with onion, and folded it into the rice while it steamed. The squash broke down just enough to thicken everything without turning it into mush. It was sweet, earthy, and filling, and it made a pot of rice feel twice as substantial. When families moved north across the border, backyard gardens shrank or disappeared, and calabaza stopped being something you grew yourself. Without that free supply, the dish quietly dropped out of the weekly rotation. Number 21. Arroz con caldo de frijol. Most families threw out their bean broth or let it sit in the back of the refrigerator until it went bad. But in the 1960s and 1970s, Mexican grandmothers along the border saved every drop of that dark, starchy liquid and used it to cook rice. You replaced the water entirely with leftover bean broth, added a clove of garlic and a pinch of cumin, and let the rice absorb all of it. The grains came out darker, richer, and carried the deep, savory taste of slow-cooked pinto beans without a single whole bean in sight. It stretched 2 meals out of 1 pot of frijoles. When canned beans replaced dried beans in most kitchens, there was no broth left to save, and this dish vanished with it. Number 20. Arroz con longaniza. Longaniza is not the same as chorizo, even though people outside of Mexico often confuse them. It is a long, thin pork sausage seasoned with vinegar, paprika, and regional spices that change from state to state. In Toluca and parts of Michoacán, families crumbled longaniza into rice while it cooked, letting the fat from the sausage season the grains from the inside out. You did not need butter or oil. The longaniza did all the work. It turned plain white rice into something smoky and rich with flecks of red running through it. The vinegar in the sausage gave the dish a subtle tang that chorizo never quite matched. As mass-produced chorizo became cheaper and easier to find in American grocery stores, longaniza fell out of everyday cooking and became something you only found at specialty carnicerias. Most people under 40 today have never tasted the difference. Number 19. Arroz con chicharrón. This is the one that used an ingredient most kitchens today would throw away. Chicharrón, the deep-fried pork skin that your grandfather bought in big sheets from the carniceria, was not just a snack. In the 1950s and 1960s across Chihuahua and Sonora, families broke those sheets into rough pieces and simmered them directly into rice with a salsa verde, made from tomatillos and serrano chilies. The chicharrón softened in the liquid and turned almost spongy, soaking up all the tang from the tomatillos while the rice absorbed the rendered pork fat. The texture was unlike anything else. You had chewy, tender pieces of pork skin folded between fluffy grains of rice, all of it coated in a bright green salsa. Some families added a handful of nopales to stretch it further, and others cracked an egg on top during the last few minutes. The reason this dish worked so well as a survival meal was simple. Chicharrón was one of the cheapest proteins available. It was a byproduct of the matanza, the annual pig slaughter that families in northern Mexico treated as a community event. Every part of the animal was used, and the skin was one of the last things processed. You could buy a bag of it for almost nothing at the market, and a few handfuls turned a pot of plain rice into a meal that tasted like someone had spent hours in the kitchen. When pork processing moved to industrial plants and fresh chicharrón became harder to find outside of dedicated shops, this dish faded from the everyday table. The bagged chicharrón you find in convenience stores today is not the same thing. It is too thin, too brittle, and it dissolves instead of softening. The original version needed the thick, hand-fried skin to hold up in the broth. Number 18. Arroz con rajas. Rajas are roasted poblano chile strips, and in the 1970s across Mexico City and into the American Southwest, they went into everything. But the simplest version was rajas stirred into white rice with a spoonful of crema and a little corn cut fresh off the cob. The heat from the poblano was mild enough for children, and the crema made the rice almost creamy without any cheese. Families roasted the poblanos directly over the gas burner, peeled the charred skin under a damp towel, and sliced them thin. The whole process took minutes, and the smell filled the kitchen. As pre-made salsas and jarred peppers took over, fewer families roasted their own chilies at home, and arroz con rajas became something you ordered at a restaurant instead of making yourself. Number 17. Arroz con nopales. Cactus paddles and rice. In the 1960s, across the arid parts of northern Mexico and into West Texas, nopals grew wild and cost absolutely nothing. You scraped the spines off with a knife, diced the paddles into small squares, and cooked them down until the sliminess burned off. Then you folded them into seasoned rice with a little tomato and onion. The nopales added a tangy, almost citrus-like bite that cut through the starch of the rice. Families who lived in areas where produce was hard to come by relied on this dish because the cactus was always there, growing along fence lines and on the edges of empty lots. When grocery stores expanded into those communities, people stopped foraging, and the dish became a curiosity rather than a staple. Number 16. Arroz con plátano macho. Fried plantain slices folded into seasoned rice sounds unusual, but in the coastal regions of Veracruz and Tabasco during the 1950s and 1960s, it was a common weeknight meal. You sliced ripe plantains into thick rounds, fried them in oil until they caramelized on both sides, and then layered them into a pot of rice seasoned with tomato and a pinch of cinnamon. The sweetness of the plantain played against the savory rice in a way that worked far better than it sounds. Families who migrated from the Gulf Coast into cities like Houston and Dallas kept making this dish for a generation, but their children and grandchildren rarely picked it up. Without access to cheap, ripe plantains at the corner store, it slowly disappeared. Number 15. Arroz verde, green rice. You blended raw cilantro, poblano peppers, and a little chicken broth into a bright green puree and used that liquid to cook the rice. The result was vivid, almost electric green, and it tasted like nothing else on the table. In the 1970s, this showed up at family gatherings and quinceañeras, alongside red rice, so you had the colors of the Mexican flag on the plate. Some families added a few leaves of epazote or a handful of spinach to deepen the color. The reason it faded is partly practical. Cilantro wilts fast, and the blending step made it more work than basic red rice. When time got short and families needed dinner on the table in 30 minutes, green rice was the first thing cut. Number 14. Arroz con mole. Leftover mole was sacred in a Mexican kitchen. Nobody threw it away. And one of the most common ways to stretch it into a second or even third meal was to stir it directly into a pot of cooked white rice. The mole coated every grain, turning the rice dark brown with that complex blend of dried chilies, chocolate, sesame, and spices that had already simmered for hours the first time around. In the 1960s and 1970s, this was what you ate on the Monday or Tuesday after a big weekend celebration. The mole had been made for a baptism or a wedding, and the pot was still half full. Rather than reheat it with more chicken, which cost money, your abuela spooned it over fresh rice and served it with warm tortillas and a squeeze of lime. The flavor was actually better the second day. Mole deepens overnight as the chiles and chocolate continue to meld, and the rice absorbed all of that concentrated flavor without diluting it the way more broth would. Some families in Puebla and Oaxaca, where mole traditions run deepest, made arroz con mole so often that it became its own dish rather than a leftover strategy. They cooked rice specifically to receive the mole, adjusting the consistency of the sauce so it would cling to the grains without making them soggy. That precision took practice, and it was passed from mother to daughter, by feel, not by recipe. When younger generations stopped making mole from scratch, because the process takes an entire day and dozens of ingredients, there was no leftover mole to fold into the rice. The dish disappeared, not because people forgot it, but because the source dried up. Number 13. Arroz con chícharos y zanahorias, rice with peas and diced carrots. This was the version of Mexican rice that showed up at almost every taqueria and family kitchen across the Southwest through the 1970s and 1980s. Frozen peas and canned carrots were cheap, available everywhere, and they added color to the plate without adding cost. You cooked the rice in tomato broth the usual way and stirred in the vegetables near the end so they kept a little bite. It was reliable, it was filling, and children ate it without complaint. The irony is that this dish was so common it became invisible. Nobody thought of it as special, and nobody bothered to teach it deliberately. It just existed. When the next generation grew up eating takeout rice from chain restaurants, they never learned that the version their grandmother made tasted completely different. Number 12. Arroz a la tumbada. This is the dish that started on the fishing boats of Veracruz. Tumbada means tumbled, and the name came from the way fishermen tossed whatever they caught that day into a pot of rice cooking over a fire on the beach. Shrimp, crab, octopus, clams, whatever came up in the net. The rice cooked in a soupy tomato and chili broth that stayed wet, almost like a stew. Nothing like the dry, fluffy rice most people expect. Families along the Gulf Coast ate this weekly, and each household had its own version depending on what the boats brought in. When commercial fishing changed and coastal families moved inland for work, the dish lost its connection to the daily catch and became a special occasion meal served mainly in restaurants. Number 11. Arroz con charales. Charales are tiny dried fish, smaller than your little finger, pulled from the freshwater lakes of Michoacán and Jalisco. In the 1950s and 1960s, you could buy a bag of them at the lake markets for almost nothing. Families fried them crispy in a little oil and folded them into seasoned rice, where they added a salty crunch and a deep, savory flavor that no amount of seasoning alone could match. The fish were so small, you ate them whole, bones and all. It was pure protein from the lake, mixed with the cheapest grain in the pantry. As those lakes shrank and the charal population declined, the fish became harder to find and more expensive. Younger families who had never grown up near the lakes did not know what to do with them, and the dish quietly faded. Number 10. Arroz con lentejas. Rice and lentils cooked together in the same pot. This was a Lenten staple across Catholic Mexican households in the 1960s and 1970s, when meat was off the table for weeks at a time. Brown lentils and white rice have almost the same cooking time, so you could throw them into the same pot with a little tomato, onion, and a dried chipotle, and they finished together without any fuss. The combination created a complete protein, though nobody called it that at the time. They just knew it kept you full. Some families in Guanajuato served this with fried plantain slices on top, creating a sweet and savory combination that made the plainness of the dish disappear. When Lenten fasting traditions loosened and younger generations stopped observing strict meatless weeks, the dish lost its reason to exist and dropped off the menu. Number 9. Arroz con chorizo. Not the bright orange chorizo and egg scramble you might be picturing. This was raw Mexican chorizo crumbled into the oil before the rice even went in. The fat rendered out of the sausage, and the rice toasted directly in that spiced brick red grease. Every grain absorbed the paprika, vinegar, and chile from the chorizo before any broth was added. The result was deeply colored rice with bits of seasoned pork scattered throughout. In the 1970s across San Antonio and the Rio Grande Valley, this was a one-pot dinner that stretched a small amount of chorizo across an entire family. You did not need a full link per person. Half a link seasoned the whole pot. The trick was letting the chorizo cook long enough to release all its oil before adding the rice. If you rushed it, the fat pooled on top instead of coating the grains. Your abuela knew exactly when it was ready by the sound of the sizzle changing pitch. Number 8. Arroz con pollo. Not the Caribbean version and not the Spanish one. The Mexican arroz con pollo was its own thing entirely. Your abuela took the cheapest chicken parts she could find, usually legs and thighs because breasts cost more, browned them in a heavy pot, and then built the rice around them. She pureed tomatoes with a clove of garlic and half an onion, fried that paste in the chicken fat until it darkened, and then added the raw rice to toast in the mixture. Chicken broth went in next, the browned chicken went back on top, and the whole thing cooked covered on a low flame until the rice absorbed everything and the chicken was falling off the bone. There was no separate pan for the protein and another for the starch. It was all one vessel, one process, one result. The rice on the bottom of the pot developed a golden crust called the pegado, and fighting over who got to scrape that layer was a family ritual. In the 1960s and 1970s, this was Sunday dinner in households across Sonora, Sinaloa, and the Texas border towns. It fed 6 or 7 people from one chicken and a couple of cups of rice. The whole meal cost less than $1 in most years. What replaced it was not a better dish. It was convenience. Rotisserie chickens from the supermarket and instant rice from a box made the slow process of building arroz con pollo from scratch feel like too much work for a weeknight. The pot itself, that heavy cast iron or clay olla that held the heat just right, got replaced by thinner non-stick pans that could not produce the same pegado. Without the right pot and the right patience, the dish never tasted the same. Number 7. Arroz rojo con papas. Red rice stretched with diced potatoes. This was the version you made when the rice was running low and payday was still 3 days away. You cut 2 or 3 potatoes into small cubes and added them to the pot so they cooked alongside the rice in the same tomato broth. The potatoes absorbed the liquid and swelled, making the pot look twice as full as it would have been with rice alone. 1 cup of dry rice and 2 potatoes could feed a table of 8 if you served it with tortillas. Families across Nuevo León and Tamaulipas leaned on this combination through the 1950s and 1960s. The dish did not disappear because people forgot it. Rice just became cheap enough that you did not need to cut it with potatoes anymore. Number 6. Arroz con elote. Fresh corn cut off the cob and folded into rice while it steamed. In the 1970s, when corn was in season and you could buy ears for almost nothing at roadside stands across the Southwest, this dish appeared on family tables at least once a week. The corn released its natural sugars into the rice as it cooked, creating a sweetness that balanced out the tomato and garlic. Some families scraped the cob after cutting the kernels to get the milky starch, which thickened the rice slightly and gave it a creamier texture. It was simple, seasonal, and free if you grew your own corn. When frozen and canned corn replaced fresh ears in most households, the dish lost its magic. Frozen kernels do not release that same milky starch, and the texture never comes close. Number 5. Torta de arroz, rice patties. Leftover cooked rice mixed with a beaten egg and a spoonful of flour, shaped into flat rounds, and fried in lard until they were golden and crispy on the outside, and soft in the middle. In the 1960s across Guanajuato and Zacatecas, this was how you used up rice that had been sitting on the stove since the day before. You could eat them plain, drizzle them with salsa, or stack them with beans inside like a small sandwich. Children loved them because they could carry them outside and eat with their hands. Some mothers sprinkled a little queso fresco on top while the patties were still hot, and the cheese melted just enough to stick. The dish required no special ingredients, no special skills, and no time at all. It was pure kitchen ingenuity, turning yesterday's dinner into something that felt brand new. When microwaves arrived and reheating leftover rice became a one-button job, there was no longer any reason to reshape it into something new. Number 4. Arroz a la Mexicana. This is the original, the base that everything else on this list borrowed from. Tomato, white onion, garlic, and sometimes a single serrano chili, blended into a smooth paste, fried in hot oil until it deepened in color, and then raw rice toasted in that mixture until each grain was coated. Boiling water or broth went in, the lid went on, and you walked away. The 1960s version was not the same as what restaurants serve today. It was drier, more intensely toasted, and the tomato flavor was more concentrated because families used fewer tomatoes and cooked them longer. The rice had a slight chew to it, almost nutty, because it spent more time in the dry pan before the liquid went in. It was not a garnish. It was a foundation, and it was eaten with nothing but tortillas and salt on nights when the pantry was nearly bare. If you ask someone what Mexican rice is, they will describe this dish without knowing its name. Number 3. Arroz con frijoles refritos. Cooked rice folded directly into a pan of hot refried beans until the two merged into one thick, starchy mass. There was no neat separation on the plate. This was not rice and beans served side by side. This was rice in the beans, inseparable, eaten with a spoon or scooped with a tortilla. In the 1950s and 1960s, this was the last resort meal. When there was genuinely nothing else in the house, you made a pot of beans, fried them in lard, and stirred in whatever rice was left. It filled stomachs, it cost nearly nothing, and it stuck to your ribs through a full day of physical work. Families who picked crops in the fields of South Texas ate this cold, wrapped in a flour tortilla, because it held together in the heat and did not spoil before noon. The dish did not have a name in most families. It was just what you ate when you ate what was left. Number 2. Arroz con leche. Abuela's version. Not the restaurant kind with a neat cinnamon swirl on top. The real arroz con leche started with leftover cooked rice reheated in a pot of whole milk with a stick of cinnamon, a strip of piloncillo, and a handful of raisins if you had them. It simmered slowly until the milk reduced and the rice turned thick and porridge-like. Families in Durango and Aguascalientes served it warm in clay bowls as an afternoon snack or a light supper during the hot months. It was one of the few desserts that did not require an oven or any special equipment, just a pot and patience. The store-bought cups of arroz con leche you find in refrigerated sections today taste nothing like it. They are too sweet, too smooth, and missing the texture of actual cooked rice grains. Number 1. Arroz con capirotada. Capirotada is the bread pudding that Mexican families made during Lent, layered with piloncillo syrup, cinnamon, cloves, and cheese. But in the poorest kitchens of the 1940s and 1950s, bread was sometimes too expensive, and families substituted cooked rice for the bread. You layered the rice with the same syrup, the same spices, and the same sliced cheese, then baked it until the top turned golden and the piloncillo caramelized around the grains. It was sweeter than any other rice dish on this list, and it served as both dessert and a filling meal during the long weeks of fasting. The bread version survived because bread became cheaper and more available. The rice version did not, because it was born from a shortage that eventually ended. And with it went one of the most inventive uses of rice that Mexican kitchens ever produced. Every single one of these dishes started with the same handful of rice. What changed was the imagination of the person standing at the stove. If any of these brought back a memory of your own kitchen or of someone who cooked like this for you, leave their name in the comments. Share this with someone who grew up eating this way. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you have not yet, and we will keep bringing these meals back to the surface where they belong.